The thunder of hooves echoed across the dusty plains as Mabel Evans clutched her wedding dress tighter around her trembling body, crouching deeper into the corner of the abandoned wagon. She had been running for 3 days now, fleeing from a marriage that promised nothing but misery and servitude. It was 1873 in the untamed Arizona Territory, and Mabel had made the desperate decision to escape her arranged marriage to Bartholomew Thornton, a man 40 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty that stretched from Tucson to Tombstone. At 22, she had decided death on the frontier was preferable to life as Thornton's bride. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Mabel's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself further into the shadows of the wagon, its weathered canvas offering minimal protection from the scorching sun and even less from whoever approached. The tattered wedding dress, once pristine white and now stained with the red dust of the desert, was her only possession besides the small pouch of coins she'd managed to take from her father's dresser before fleeing. The rider slowed his horse to a walk, and Mabel held her breath. The shadow of a man fell across the opening of the wagon. "I know you're in there," a deep voice called out, neither threatening nor particularly friendly. "I'm not looking to cause any trouble." Mabel remained silent, her fingers inching toward the small knife concealed in her boot, her only means of protection. "Look, madam, there's a dust storm brewing on the horizon. This old wagon won't provide much shelter when it hits." The man's voice carried a soft drawl, measured and calm. "I've got a camp set up in a protected canyon about half a mile from here. You're welcome to wait out the storm there." The stranger dismounted, and Mabel could now see his silhouette against the harsh afternoon light, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable wide-brimmed hat of a cowboy. "I promise I mean no harm," he said, taking a step closer but not attempting to enter the wagon. "The name's Dawson Miller. I run cattle about 30 miles north of here." Mabel swallowed hard, weighing her options. The distant horizon had indeed darkened ominously, and she knew enough about desert storms to recognize the danger. "How do I know I can trust you?" she finally asked, her voice cracking from thirst and disuse. The cowboy remained where he stood. "You don't. But I reckon your chances are better with me than with that storm. And if it helps any, I give you my word that you'll come to no harm under my protection." There was something in his voice, a steadiness, perhaps, or a quiet dignity that made Mabel want to believe him. With the knife still gripped tightly in her palm, she slowly emerged from the shadows. Dawson Miller was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with sun-weathered skin and clear blue eyes that regarded her with neither pity nor judgment. His clothes were dusty but well kept, and the revolver at his hip looked like it was worn more out of necessity than bravado. "You're running from something," he stated matter-of-factly, taking in her disheveled appearance and the wedding dress. Mabel straightened her shoulders. "Someone, not something," Dawson nodded once. "Well, your business is your own, Miss Evans, Mabel Evans, Miss Evans," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "The offer stands. Storm's coming fast, and we'd best get moving if we're going to beat it." Mabel hesitated just a moment longer before making her decision. "Very well, Mr. Miller." Dawson helped her onto his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, before mounting behind her. He was careful to maintain a respectful distance as they rode, his arms reaching around her only to hold the reins. True to his word, they arrived at a small canyon just as the first gusts of the dust storm began to whip across the plains. The camp was simple but well-established, a small tent, a fire pit ringed with stones, and provisions stored carefully under a natural rock overhang. He had clearly chosen the location with an eye for protection from the elements and possible threats. "It's not much," Dawson said as he helped her dismount, "but it's secure. The storm shouldn't reach us too badly here." Mabel watched as he efficiently cared for his horse, removing the saddle and bridle before leading the animal to a sheltered area where water and feed awaited. There was something comforting about the practiced movements, the evidence of a man who took responsibility seriously. Are you hungry?" he asked, returning to where she stood. She nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. She hadn't eaten properly since fleeing Tucson. Dawson set about building a fire with quick, practiced movements. "I've got some beans and bacon and coffee if you'd like." "That sounds wonderful," Mabel replied, sinking down onto a flat rock near the fire pit. "Thank you." As Dawson prepared the meal, Mabel found herself studying him. His movements were efficient but unhurried, and occasionally he would glance up at the sky, tracking the storm's progress. There was a quietness about him that she found unexpectedly calming. "Have you been out here long?" she asked, breaking the silence. "On my own, about 5 years," he replied, stirring the beans in a small cast iron pot. "But I was born to this life. My father ran cattle in Texas before the war changed everything." Mabel nodded, understanding what remained unsaid. The Civil War had reshaped countless lives, leaving some in ruins and forcing others to seek new beginnings in the West. "And you?" he asked, not looking up from his cooking. "If you don't mind my asking, what brings a woman in a wedding dress to an abandoned wagon in the middle of nowhere?" Mabel twisted the fabric of her dress between her fingers. "I was to be married today," she said softly, "to a man I did not choose and could never love." Dawson nodded, saying nothing, and Mabel found herself continuing. "Bartholomew Thornton. He owns half the businesses in Tucson and has my father in debt up to his eyeballs. The marriage was to clear those debts." She gave a bitter laugh. "My father sold me to save his own skin." Dawson handed her a tin plate of beans and bacon, his expression unreadable. "Thornton," he said, the name clearly familiar to him. "He's got a reputation." "Yes," Mabel agreed, accepting the plate gratefully, "and not one that suggests a happy future for his bride." They ate in silence for a while, the wind howling beyond their sheltered canyon. As dusk began to fall, the storm intensified, but true to Dawson's word, their position protected them from the worst of it. "You have a plan?" he asked finally, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Mabel accepted the hot drink, warming her hands around it. "Get as far from Tucson as possible. Beyond that," she shrugged. "I have a little money, enough to start somewhere new, perhaps." "Thornton won't give up easily," Dawson observed. "Men like him consider it a matter of pride." "I know," Mabel said quietly, "but I couldn't stay. I couldn't." Her voice caught, and she took a sip of coffee to steady herself. Dawson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You need a safe place, at least until the hunt dies down. Do such places exist for women like me?" Mabel asked, not expecting an answer. Dawson was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My ranch is small, but it's remote. I've got a cabin with an extra room. It's nothing fancy, but you'd be welcome to stay there while you figure out your next move." Mabel looked up in surprise. "You'd offer shelter to a stranger, a woman being hunted by one of the most powerful men in the territory." "I've got no love for Thornton," Dawson said simply. "He tried to run my neighbors off their land last year, used every dirty trick in the book." "And did he succeed?" A small smile crossed Dawson's face. "No, madam, he did not. Turns out even Bartholomew Thornton can be stopped when folks stand together." Mabel considered his offer. The idea of a safe haven, even temporarily, was tempting beyond words. But she was acutely aware of the danger she might bring to his doorstep. "I wouldn't want to put you at risk," she said finally. Dawson shrugged. "Risk is part of life out here. Besides, my place is hard to find if you don't know where you're looking. We'd see trouble coming long before it arrived." The storm continued to rage outside their shelter, and as the night deepened, Dawson prepared a sleeping area for Mabel inside the tent. He himself settled by the fire, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm night. "Get some rest," he told her. "We'll head north at first light, assuming the storm's passed." Mabel paused at the entrance to the tent. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Miller?" Truly, Dawson looked up at her, his face half illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Because out here, a person's word and how they treat others is all that really matters, and I couldn't live with myself if I turned away someone in need." He paused, then added more softly, especially someone with the courage to choose freedom over security. Mabel felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee. "Thank you," she said simply, and retreated into the tent. True to his word, they set out at dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape transformed. Sand drifted in new patterns, and tumbleweeds had collected in unlikely places. Mabel rode behind Dawson again, but this time she found herself less tense, more willing to lean against his back when the terrain demanded it. They traveled steadily northward, Dawson occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of knowledge about the land they crossed. By mid-afternoon, they had entered more rugged country, with scattered pinyon pines and juniper trees breaking up the landscape. "Not much further," Dawson said as they followed a narrow trail that wound between rocky outcroppings. "Just over that ridge." When they crested the hill, Mabel caught her breath. Below them lay a small valley, surprisingly green compared to the terrain they had crossed. A modest cabin stood near a stream with corrals and a small barn nearby. Cattle grazed in the distance, and a thin column of smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. "Someone's there," Mabel said, suddenly tense again. "That'll be Eduardo," Dawson replied reassuringly. "He helps with the cattle. Comes from a ranch family down in Sonora. One of the best men I know with livestock." They descended into the valley, and as they approached the cabin, a wiry man in his 40s emerged, raising a hand in greeting. "Dawson, back sooner than expected," he called, his English accented but clear. "Got caught by the storm," Dawson replied, dismounting and helping Mabel down. "Eduardo, this is Miss Mabel Evans. She'll be staying with us for a while." Eduardo's eyes took in Mabel's dusty wedding dress, but his expression remained courteous. "Welcome to Rockingham Ranch, Miss Evans," he said with a slight bow. Mabel thanked him, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. As if reading her thoughts, Dawson spoke up. Eduardo's wife, Lucia, left some clothes behind when they moved to their own place last year. "You're welcome to them until we can get you something else." Eduardo nodded. They are in the chest in the spare room. Lucia would be pleased for them to be used. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean and well-ordered. A main room served as kitchen and living area, with 2 doors leading to what Mabel assumed were bedrooms. Dawson showed her to the smaller of the 2, a snug space with a narrow bed, a chest, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. "Take your time getting settled," he said, lingering in the doorway. "I need to check on things with Eduardo, but there's water heating on the stove if you'd like to wash up." Left alone, Mabel sank onto the bed, overcome by the events of the past few days. She had fled one life and found herself deposited into another, completely different one. The enormity of it all suddenly crashed down upon her, and tears she had been holding back for days finally spilled over. She allowed herself this moment of weakness, this release, before resolutely wiping her eyes. Opening the chest, she found simple but well-made dresses, a few blouses and skirts, and thankfully, undergarments. Selecting the items that looked most likely to fit, Mabel took advantage of the promised hot water to wash away the dust of their journey. When she emerged from her room some time later, dressed in a simple blue cotton dress that was only slightly too large, she found Dawson at the stove, preparing what smelled like stew. "Eduardo's gone home for the night," he said, glancing up. "He and Lucia have a place about 2 miles east of here. The clothes fit well enough," Mabel said, smoothing the fabric of the dress. "Please thank Lucia for me when you see her." "You can thank her yourself," Dawson replied. "She'll likely ride over tomorrow when Eduardo tells her we have a guest. She's been trying to convince me to hire a housekeeper for months." He smiled slightly. "I think she worries I'm living like a savage out here." Mabel looked around the neat cabin. "If this is savage living, Mr. Miller, I'd say Lucia's concerns are unfounded." A hint of color touched Dawson's cheeks at the compliment. "Well, I try to keep things in order, and please call me Dawson. Mr. Miller makes me feel like my father." "Dawson then," Mabel agreed, "if you'll call me Mabel." Over dinner, Dawson explained more about the ranch, how he'd purchased it from a discouraged settler 3 years prior and slowly built it into something sustainable. "It's not grand," he admitted, "but it's mine, free and clear. 20 head of cattle now, with calves coming in the spring, a few horses, enough to get by and put a little aside each year." "It's more than many have," Mabel observed. "True enough." Dawson regarded her thoughtfully. "May I ask what skills you have, Mabel, for when you decide where to go next?" The question startled her. In truth, she had been raised to be a suitable wife for a man of means, educated enough to be presentable in society, but trained primarily in household management and the social graces. "I can read and write," she said slowly. "I'm good with figures. I play the piano tolerably well." She gave a self-deprecating laugh, none of which seems particularly useful out here. "Reading and writing and figures are always useful," Dawson countered. "Many of the ranchers around here can barely sign their names, and music." His expression softened. "Well, that's a rare gift in these parts." After dinner, they sat on the small porch, watching as twilight settled over the valley. Mabel found herself strangely at peace despite the uncertainty of her situation. "What will you do," she asked eventually, "if Thornton's men come looking for me here?" Dawson didn't answer immediately, his gaze still on the distant mountains. "I meant what I said about seeing trouble coming," he said finally, "but if it does come." He turned to look at her directly. "I gave my word that you'd be safe. I don't give my word lightly." There was something in his eyes, a quiet determination that made Mabel believe him absolutely. In that moment, she knew that this man, this cowboy who had found her hiding in a wagon and offered her shelter, would indeed stand between her and danger. "Thank you," she said softly, aware that the words were inadequate. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Mabel found unexpectedly comfortable. True to Dawson's prediction, Lucia arrived the next morning, a cheerful, robust woman in her 30s who embraced Mabel like a long-lost sister and immediately set about putting the cabin to rights, despite its already tidy state. "Men," she said to Mabel with an exaggerated roll of her eyes, "they think if the floor is swept, all is well. They do not see the dust on the high shelves or the windows that need washing." Mabel found herself working alongside Lucia, grateful for the woman's easy acceptance and practical approach to life. When Lucia discovered that Mabel had never baked bread, she declared this a tragedy that must be remedied immediately and spent the afternoon teaching her the process, filling the cabin with the mouth-watering aroma of fresh bread. Dawson, returning from checking on a pregnant heifer, found the two women laughing in the kitchen, flour dusting Mabel's hair and a smudge of dough on her cheek. He paused in the doorway, an expression Mabel couldn't quite decipher crossing his face. "Something smells good," he said, removing his hat. "Mabel is learning to bake," Lucia announced proudly. "She has good hands for it, not afraid of the dough." Mabel brushed self-consciously at the flour on her dress. "I'm afraid I'm making quite a mess of your kitchen." "Our kitchen," Dawson corrected automatically, then looked slightly embarrassed. "I mean, while you're staying here, consider it yours as much as mine." That evening, after Lucia had returned home with a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden for them, Dawson suggested that Mabel might want to accompany him on his rounds the next day. "Thought you might like to see more of the ranch," he said, a little hesitantly. "If you're interested." Mabel was indeed interested. Though she had grown up in Tucson, her experience with the countryside had been limited to occasional chaperoned picnics or journeys by stagecoach. The idea of exploring the land that Dawson clearly loved so much appealed to her greatly. The following morning, they set out on horseback. Dawson had provided her with a gentle mare named Daisy, and Mabel found that her childhood riding lessons came back to her quickly. They rode along the stream that provided water for the ranch, then up into the foothills where most of the cattle grazed during the summer months. "In winter, we'll bring them down to the lower pastures," Dawson explained as they paused to rest the horses in the shade of a large oak. "It's more work, keeping them fed then, but the calves do better with the protection from the winds." Mabel listened, fascinated by the care and thought that went into managing the ranch. It was so different from the world she had known, more immediate, more connected to the rhythms of the land and seasons. "How did you learn all this?" she asked. "You said your father ran cattle in Texas, but this seems different somehow." Dawson nodded, absently stroking his horse's neck. "Pa ran his operation the old way, big herds, long drives to market, lots of cowboys. It worked for a time." His expression grew distant. "But he never adapted when things started changing, railroads coming closer, markets shifting. He was too set in his ways." "And you?" "I worked for other ranchers after Pa lost everything, saw different ways of doing things, some better than others." He gestured to the land around them. "This is small by Texas standards, but it's sustainable. That's what matters to me." As they continued their tour, Mabel began to see the ranch through Dawson's eyes, not just land and animals, but a carefully balanced system that required constant attention and care. By the time they returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, she had a new appreciation for the life he had built here. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Mabel helped around the cabin, gradually taking over more of the cooking and household tasks. She found she enjoyed the work, especially with Lucia's cheerful instruction. Dawson taught her about the ranch, and Mabel discovered a surprising aptitude for keeping the accounts, organizing the records in a way that Dawson admitted was far better than his own haphazard system. "You've got a real head for business," he remarked one evening as she finished updating the ledger. "You could run a shop or work for a bank with skills like that." Mabel looked up from the neat columns of figures. "Is that a hint that I should be planning my departure, Mr. Miller?" She asked lightly, though something in her chest tightened at the thought. Dawson looked startled. "No, not at all. I only meant," he broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I only meant that you have options, more than you might have realized." The subject of her eventual departure remained mostly unspoken between them, though Mabel knew she couldn't stay indefinitely. Yet as the days passed, she found herself increasingly reluctant to think about leaving. There was a peace here, a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never experienced before. And then there was Dawson himself. His quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, his gentle consideration, all of these had gradually woven themselves into her consciousness, until the thought of not seeing him each day left an ache in her heart that she tried not to examine too closely. It was Eduardo who brought the news, riding hard into the ranch yard one afternoon while Dawson and Mabel were mending a section of corral fence. "Riders," he said without preamble, dismounting in a flurry of dust. "4 men asking questions at the Wilson place about a missing bride." Mabel felt the blood drain from her face. Dawson's expression hardened as he turned to her. "Get what you need from the cabin," he said quietly. "We've got to place a line shack up in the hills. They won't find you there." "I can't keep running," Mabel said, a strange calm settling over her. "And I won't bring danger to your home." Dawson stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "Mabel, these men work for Thornton. They won't just politely ask you to come back." "I know." She met his gaze steadily. "But I won't hide while you face them, not when it's me they want." Eduardo cleared his throat. "Perhaps neither is necessary," he suggested. "Thornton's men are looking for a runaway bride, yes. A woman alone," Dawson frowned, not following. "Yes, and," a slow smile spread across Eduardo's face. "But a married woman, living openly with her husband on a respectable ranch, this is not what they seek." Understanding dawned in Dawson's eyes, followed quickly by alarm. "Eduardo, that's a temporary solution," Eduardo finished firmly, "until these men have searched and gone. A marriage that exists only in the eyes of those who would harm Miss Mabel." Mabel's heart raced as she considered the idea. To pretend to be Dawson's wife, it was outrageous, improper, and yet potentially effective. Would it work? She asked, looking between the 2 men. "It might," Dawson admitted reluctantly. "If they believe you've been here longer than you have, if they accept that you're married and settled." "Then that's what we'll do," Mabel decided, her mind racing ahead. Eduardo, how long before they reach here? Tomorrow, perhaps. They are checking each ranch carefully. Then we have time to prepare, she turned to Dawson. Unless you object, he studied her face, his expression unreadable. No, he said finally, I don't object. But Mabel, you should know, whatever he had been about to say was cut off by the arrival of Lucia, who had followed her husband at a more moderate pace. When the plan was explained to her, she embraced it with enthusiasm. Yes, this will work, she declared, already mentally rearranging the cabin. But there is much to do. Come, Mabel, we must make it look as if you have lived here for months, not weeks. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Lucia brought items from her own home to add a more feminine touch to the cabin. Mabel's few possessions were distributed throughout both bedrooms, creating the illusion that she and Dawson shared the larger one. Eduardo spoke with the nearest neighbors, enlisting them in the deception should Thornton's men come calling. Through it all, Dawson was quiet, going along with the preparations but saying little. As evening fell, Mabel found him on the porch, staring out at the gathering darkness. Are you having second thoughts? She asked, joining him. He glanced at her, then back at the valley. No. It's the right thing to do. But Dawson sighed, his shoulders tense. But I don't like lying, even for a good reason. Nor do I, Mabel admitted, but I like the thought of being dragged back to Thornton even less. There's something else you should know, Dawson said after a moment. Something I should have told you before. Mabel felt a flicker of alarm. What is it? I knew who you were that day I found you in the wagon. He turned to face her fully now. Or at least I had a good idea. Word had spread about Thornton's bride running off. There were men searching all around Tucson. Mabel stared at him, processing this revelation. You knew and you still helped me? Yes. His gaze was steady on hers. I told you I have no love for Thornton. What I didn't say was that I've been watching him take whatever he wants for years, regardless of who gets hurt, when I heard his bride had run rather than marry him. A small smile touched his lips. Well, I thought she must be someone with extraordinary courage. Something warm unfurled in Mabel's chest. And now, having met this brave bride, what do you think? Dawson's expression softened. I think she's even braver than I imagined, and smarter, and more determined. He paused, then added quietly, and I think any man would be fortunate indeed to have her truly as his wife. The air between them seemed to still, charged with unspoken feelings. Mabel found herself moving closer, drawn by the warmth in his eyes. Dawson, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment was broken by Lucia calling them in for dinner. Dawson straightened, something like regret crossing his face. We should eat, he said. Tomorrow will come early enough. Morning brought clear skies and a tension that hung over the ranch like storm clouds. Lucia had returned at dawn, bringing fresh bread and more items to enhance the illusion that Mabel had been living at the ranch for some time. Now she and Eduardo waited in their own cabin, ready to provide corroboration if needed. Mabel wore one of Lucia's simpler dresses, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She moved around the kitchen, preparing coffee and trying to appear calm despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Dawson had ridden out at first light to check on the cattle, a normal part of his routine that would not arouse suspicion. It was just past 10 when the sound of approaching horses reached her. Setting aside the dishes she had been washing, Mabel dried her hands and stepped onto the porch. 4 riders were making their way up the trail to the cabin, dust rising behind them in the morning light. Dawson appeared from the direction of the barn, walking unhurriedly to stand beside her. His hand found hers, warm and reassuring. Remember, he said softly, you've been my wife for nearly 6 months. We met in Prescott when you were visiting relatives. Mabel nodded, squeezing his hand. I remember. The riders drew up in front of the cabin, and Mabel immediately recognized the man in front, Samuel Perkins, Thornton's chief enforcer. His cold eyes swept over her, narrowing in recognition. Well, well, he drawled, remaining mounted while his companion spread out slightly. Look what we have here. Mr. Thornton will be mighty interested to know where his runaway bride has gotten to. Dawson stepped forward, still holding Mabel's hand. I think you're mistaken, friend. This is my wife, Mabel Miller, Perkins sneered. Is that so? Funny, she looks an awful lot like Mabel Evans to me, the woman who was supposed to marry Mr. Thornton 3 weeks ago. I'm afraid I don't know anything about that, Dawson replied evenly. My wife and I have been married since January. Ask anyone in these parts. One of the other riders leaned forward. Sam, maybe we got it wrong. The girl we're looking for ran off on her wedding day. This woman's been up here for months. Perkins ignored him, his gaze still fixed on Mabel. Let her speak for herself. You're Mabel Evans, ain't you, girl? The one who stole money from her father and left Thornton waiting at the altar. Mabel met his gaze steadily. My name is Mabel Miller. I've never even been to Tucson. Perkins dismounted, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. You expect me to believe that? You think I don't know what you look like? Thornton had your picture on his desk for weeks before the wedding. I don't care what you believe, Dawson cut in, his voice hardening. But you're on my land, disturbing my wife, and I'd appreciate it if you'd state your business and move on. The tension stretched between them, Perkins clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spat into the dust. We'll need more than your say-so. Anyone else around here who can vouch for this? Marriage? As a matter of fact, yes, came Eduardo's voice as he rode up with Lucia. I was at their wedding. Small affair, but memorable. Lucia dismounted gracefully, coming to stand beside Mabel, and I helped make her wedding dress, simple but beautiful. She smiled at Perkins with steel behind her eyes. Perhaps you would like to see the marriage certificate. Dawson keeps it in the family Bible. Perkins glanced between them all, doubt creeping into his expression. Thornton won't like this, he muttered. Thornton doesn't have any authority up here, Dawson replied calmly. Now my wife was about to serve coffee. You're welcome to a cup before you ride on, but then I'll have to ask you to leave. We've got a ranch to run. For a moment, Mabel thought Perkins might refuse to back down. Then, surprisingly, he laughed a harsh, ugly sound. Coffee sounds good, he said, gesturing to his men to dismount. And I'd sure like to hear more about this. Whirlwind romance. The next hour was one of the most tense of Mabel's life. She served coffee with hands that trembled only slightly, listening as Dawson calmly answered Perkins's probing questions. Eduardo and Lucia added details to the fabricated history, their stories aligning perfectly with the narrative they had created. Perkins remained skeptical, but without proof that Mabel was lying, he had little choice but to accept their claims. When he finally rose to leave, his parting words carried a veiled threat. Mr. Thornton will be interested to hear about your wife, Miller. He might even pay you a visit himself sometime. He's welcome anytime, Dawson replied evenly, though I can't promise he'll find what he's looking for. After the riders had disappeared down the trail, the 4 conspirators let out a collective breath. They will be back, Eduardo predicted grimly. Perkins is not convinced. No, Dawson agreed, but we've bought some time. Thank you both for your help. After Eduardo and Lucia had departed with promises to remain vigilant, Mabel sank onto a chair, the tension of the encounter finally catching up with her. You were magnificent, Dawson said, sitting across from her. I almost believed we'd been married for months myself. Mabel managed a weak smile. It was easier than I expected to pretend to be your wife. Something flickered in Dawson's eyes. Mabel, there's something I need to say, something I've been wanting to tell you, her heart quickened. Yes, these past weeks having you here. He paused, searching for words. I've never felt this way about anyone before, and I know it's too soon and there's the situation with Thornton, but Dawson, Mabel interrupted gently. I feel the same way. His eyes widened slightly. You do? Yes. She reached across the table to take his hand. I didn't expect it, I wasn't looking for it, but here it is all the same. A slow smile spread across his face, lighting his eyes with a warmth that made Mabel's breath catch. So what do we do now? I think, Mabel said, squeezing his hand, that we might need to make our lie into the truth. For safety's sake, of course. Dawson's smile deepened. For safety's sake, he agreed, bringing her hand to his lips, and perhaps for a few other reasons as well. 3 weeks later, with Eduardo and Lucia standing as witnesses, Mabel and Dawson were married by a traveling preacher who had stopped at the ranch for the night. The ceremony was simple, held on the porch where they had first faced down Perkins and his men. Mabel wore a dress that Lucia had helped her make, and Dawson had ridden all the way to Prescott to find a proper ring. As they exchanged vows, Mabel thought of how far she had come from the frightened bride hiding in an abandoned wagon. She had fled one marriage only to find herself eagerly embracing another, but this time on her own terms, with a man who saw her strength rather than her obedience as her greatest value. "I promise," Dawson said as he slipped the ring onto her finger, "to stand beside you through whatever comes. To protect your freedom as fiercely as my own, and to love you for as long as I live." Mabel blinked back tears as she replied, "And I promise to face whatever comes at your side, to build our home with courage and honesty, and to love you with all that I am for all of my days." Later, as they stood together on the porch watching the sun set over their land, Dawson pulled her close. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "About Thornton, I mean. He won't give up easily." Mabel leaned into his embrace, secure in a way she had never thought possible. "I was afraid when I was alone," she admitted. "But not anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Dawson pressed a kiss to her hair. "Together," he agreed. "That's a promise I intend to keep," and he did. When Thornton himself arrived at their ranch 6 months later, bringing not only Perkins but a hired gun with a reputation for violence, it was not just Dawson who stood against them. The neighboring ranchers, alerted by Eduardo, arrived in time to make it clear that the community stood with the Millers. Faced with unexpected opposition and the unwavering determination in Mabel's eyes, Thornton finally accepted defeat. "You've made your choice, girl," he said bitterly. "Let's hope you don't live to regret it." "The only thing I would have regretted," Mabel replied, her hand firmly in Dawson's, "was not having the courage to choose my own path." As the years passed, the Rockingham Ranch prospered. Mabel's head for business complemented Dawson's practical knowledge, and together they expanded their operation, becoming known throughout the territory for both their fine cattle and their fair dealings. When their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength, they named her Hope, a testament to what had brought them together and carried them forward. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and their children played in the yard, Dawson and Mabel would sit together on the porch of their home. In those moments of peaceful reflection, they would often think back to that first meeting, a frightened bride hiding in a wagon corner, and the cowboy who sat beside her and promised peace. A promise that, against all odds, he had kept.